Sherri Papini is this so-called dead-by-the-press supermom who is living the American dream with a loving, doting husband, 2 young children, 1 boy and 1 girl, including a nice home, her own transportation, probably even owned a Yorkshire Terrier. Okay, so I made that last one up, but it's possible they had a frou-frou lapdog. Anyways, she had all the nice things, including a nice life. Then from her home in Northern California in November of 2016, 34-year-old Sherri went out jogging that morning and then suddenly, poof, disappeared. Then 3 weeks later, like magic, she reappears, just in time for Thanksgiving. But things are not always as they seem, and in the spring of 2017, investigators found a crucial piece of evidence that would turn this case around. They no longer believed Sherri was abducted. They believed the evidence would prove that she simply ran away. On the surface, Sherri's life appeared to be one plucked from a fairy tale. Her husband was once her childhood sweetheart in middle school, whom she reunited with later in life, and the two married and started a family. Sherri and Keith seem to complement each other very well. As you can see in these pictures, they look like a perfect match. Keith worked as an audio-video specialist at Best Buy, and she was a stay-at-home mom of 2 small children. They lived in a very nice home and apparently were doing so well that she could afford daycare when she wanted time for herself. Like the day she went out missing, she dropped the kids off at daycare that morning, returned home, and went out jogging. It makes absolutely no sense to want to mess up a good thing, such as the comfortable life she was able to live. But like I said before, things are not always as they appear, because the evidence they have against her as of now shows that her husband and children were living with a complete stranger, not the supermom everyone labeled her as. I remember the story when I watched the documentary that aired on 2020 and 2016. By now, Sherri had been found and was home. However, her greatest defender, her husband Keith, discussed in an interview at his home in Redding, California, about the ordeal he and his children went through while his wife was so-called missing, then found. But she declined to be filmed or interviewed. So for me, even though this poor guy could hardly get through much of the interview without crying, as I watched, red flags went up. Most missing people that disappear for that amount of time are usually killed by their abductors or by their own spouse or someone they know, which usually involves a motive. The moment she was declared missing, according to her husband Keith, he came home from work expecting to be greeted at the door as usual by Sherri and the kids. She ignored their children were anywhere to be found. She wasn't answering her phone, and when he thought to call the daycare to inquire if perhaps she had dropped them off for whatever reason, he became extremely concerned for his wife when he was told yes, she dropped them off that morning and they were still there. And I am not saying that a wife should have to call and give her husband the play-by-play of her daily plans, but being she didn't have a job other than being a housewife and a main caregiver to their children, I am assuming for him it was probably out of the norm of her regular routine that she would leave the kids in daycare all day long without leaving a note, a text, or even calling him to let him know what her plans were that day so that he wouldn't worry. But worry he did. Immediately finding out his children were okay was a relief, but now there was no explanation whatsoever of why his wife was nowhere to be found. Keith decided to track her cell phone using a GPS app tracking device in an attempt to find her, which led him to discovering her cell phone on the ground about a mile from their home. Her case became high profile immediately, and an intense search ensued as her community banded together to help find and bring her home safe. They had no idea what had occurred or why she was taken, but the neighbors rallied support around Keith and began passing out flyers in hopes that someone would recognize her and help bring her home. There were missing posters displayed everywhere. A GoFundMe account was created to help the family, which raised more than $49,000, and the story received notoriety around the world in an effort to grab the attention of anyone who knew anything about her whereabouts. Then suddenly, Sherri reappeared 22 days later and 150 miles away from home, wandering along a highway around 4 a.m. where she flagged down a passing motorist for help. Although she was found battered and bruised, emaciated from extreme weight loss, and a chain around her waist and clamps around her wrist, along with all her long blonde hair chopped off, and had even been branded on her right shoulder. Her husband, children, family, and friends were elated and relieved that she was still alive. When she was found wandering along that highway, she told authorities she had been abducted at gunpoint and held captive by two armed, masked Hispanic women, one in her 20s or 30s and the other older, maybe in her 40s or 50s, and that they spoke Spanish most of the time. So there are definitely racist elements to this story, which she probably used as an excuse because at one time in her life, supposedly before she was married to Keith, in a 2007 blog post in which she wrote about getting into fights with Latina girls because she was, quote, drug-free, white, and proud of my blood and heritage, end quote, and she called the music the two women played as that really annoying Mexican music. She even went as far as to describe their demeanor and hygienic habits, and that one was, quote unquote, really mean with breath that smelled like sweetened coffee. She also explained that she spent most of her time in captivity chained in a room with boarded up windows, and that these two women played extremely loud music while torturing her. These were basically all the details she told authorities, which were extremely vague and did nothing to help them in tracking her abductors. She didn't give them any answers as to why these two women even took her. I mean, who goes missing on purpose? Of course, we've heard about all these selfish cases in the news before, like the case of the runaway bride, Jennifer Wilbanks, who faked her own disappearance to avoid getting married back in 2005. So Sherri isn't the first to pull this stunt, but her case is far more disturbing, since she faked her own abduction when she had a husband, family, and seemingly nice life for quite a number of years prior. Plus, other information is coming to light on Sherri's past because in 2003, a 911 phone call recently released revealed that her own mother told police that her daughter was harming herself and blaming it on her. So, it is pretty clear that Sherri has long suffered from some sort of mental illness. So why did she run away? The police believe she did it to spend time with the ex-boyfriend, but the ex-boyfriend is claiming that a sexual relationship did not occur. And even if she didn't have an affair, she still cheated. Not only did she cheat her husband, children, and her community by putting them through 3 weeks of mental torture and hell, she cheated the system while committing acts of fraud, knowing authorities were spending time and money on resources to help find her, not to mention the $49,000 raised through the GoFundMe account. In the spring of 2017, the investigation into finding her kidnappers took a turn when the results from some male DNA evidence collected from her clothing, the sweatpants and underwear she was wearing when they found her, came back indicating that the DNA could not belong to the two fabricated women she claimed took her, or any woman for that matter, since it was a male DNA, nor did it belong to her husband, Keith. After obtaining the male DNA, investigators were certain that this would lead them to solving the case and finding out the truth. It started to make sense to them of why her abduction story was so vague. Yes, her family had her back, and to them that was what mattered most, even though I'm certain Keith wanted justice for his wife. But for investigators, it was their job to keep going until they captured these two dangerous people who could inflict such harm because they could do it again. However, with the new findings, it appeared to them Sherri had been lying since the DNA they found could only be that of a male. They knew it was time to investigate Sherri, not as a victim but as an offender, and now believed that she planned her own disappearance by running away. And not only that, but the question of why. Why would she fake her own abduction and disappearance? There was no rhyme or reason whatsoever once she was found that even involved a motive of why she was taken. And the excuses she fabricated to explain her disappearance were basically just a part of her charade to mislead the investigators to nowhere, and to avoid exposing her secret, which was a lie that would go on for years as investigators, including the FBI, searched for her abductors in hopes of closing the case and serving justice. By March 2020, they found the match and identified the person whose DNA matched what was found on her clothing, which turned out to be an old boyfriend's from a previous relationship that ended in 2006. The way they found him was through what is called familial DNA, and when they tested it, it linked to the ex-boyfriend's father, whose DNA was in the CODIS database. CODIS is the acronym for the Combined DNA Index System and is the generic term used to describe the FBI's program of support for criminal justice DNA databases. So what that means is that the ex-boyfriend's father must have been convicted of a crime at some point in his life. In June 2020, Investigators collected a bottle of Honest Honey green tea from the trash outside of the ex-boyfriend's apartment for testing, and the results obtained from that bottle's mouthpiece did in fact conclude the DNA belonged to her ex-boyfriend, a former sports shop worker named James Reyes. Yeah, this guy. By August, investigators confronted him, and he confessed that he helped her to run away because she needed to escape her abusive husband who had been beating and raping her. He also admitted that he and Sherri had communicated over prepaid phones, also known as burner phones, and that the two of them plotted this scheme together to make it to appear as though she had been abducted. He picked her up from where she lived in Redding and drove her back to his 2-bedroom apartment in Costa Mesa, California. In addition, he also told them how they inflicted her injuries, which were mostly self-inflicted, including chopping off her own hair, starving herself on purpose, hitting and burning herself, and what she couldn't do to herself, she instructed him to do. He told investigators that the branding of her right shoulder was her idea, so he bought a wood-burning tool from Hobby Lobby to inflict the injury she requested. He disclosed that he was uncertain of her intentions during the time she stayed with him, but that he believed they might end up back together. However, he claims the two were never intimate with each other, and the entire time she was there, he slept on the couch. The fact he is saying the two of them remained platonic during her stay with him makes this case even more perplexing. She is either just completely crazy and had no reason to do what she did, or they are lying about not having an affair with each other. I mean, people who cheat are liars, so there you go. But if he is telling the truth that they were never intimate, this case makes zero sense. Usually, when a spouse chooses to spend time with an ex, especially her method, cheating is involved and lies are the cover-up. He even admitted to the police that she had contacted him out of the blue in 2015 and told him she planned to run away with him. I mean, I don't know what Sherri's deal is. To go to such lengths with no real reason. It just doesn't make sense, and the more I research this debacle, the more mind-boggling it's getting to be. Because to me, and what I imagine what the world would speculate about this case, is that the only reason someone would do this would be to cheat and formulate a plan as crazy as this one to attempt to cover it up. Rice told the authorities the reason for her reappearance was because she began to miss her children. It's starting to explain why she didn't participate in that 2020 interview. This is a woman desperately trying to not only maintain the Supermom image, which is really just a facade, but determined to avoid being caught in a lie in the planning of her own disappearance. She fears public disgrace and the shame this case will expose. In other words, she is more worried about how she will appear to the world than she was when she concocted such an evil scheme to trick her family into believing she was missing and tortured, while she was really just in hiding, wasting money and resources of the authorities who are trying to find her. In addition to the GoFundMe donations and the investigation resources of money wasted on her, authorities have also disclosed that she was given more than $30,000 from California's Victim Compensation Board after her alleged kidnapping to pay for therapy visits and the ambulance ride that took her to the hospital when she came out of hiding. Sherri Papini was arrested at the beginning of March 2022 for allegedly faking her own kidnapping, lying to federal agents, and mail fraud. Authorities say the hoax she pulled off cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars to investigate, and the Department of Justice wants to hold her to account. If convicted, she could face up to 25 years in prison. Here she is leaving the Sacramento jail 5 days after her arrest and out on bond, in tears and desperately trying to avoid the media.
You don't want to say anything at all? Do you want to say anything? Any comment of this lady?
Hey, God, girl. You just go to prison? Huh?
How do you explain this to your family?
You think you'll be doing 5 or 20 years? What about all the hard people who donated money, Sherri? Huh?
What do you say about the state saying that you defrauded $30,000?
Oh, Sherri? Sherri, what do you want to tell people? How was it like in jail? You cheat on your husband?
The now 39-year-old Supermom to Dupermom was released on Tuesday, March 8th on a $120,000 bond with conditions that include she must surrender her passport, as she is obviously a flight risk, and seek psychiatric treatment. Back in 2016, there was an intense search for Sherri and a husband in severe agony, including their 2 small children, who were missing mommy and were looking to daddy for answers. This poor husband was sick with worry from the disappearance of his wife and the difficulty in having to explain her absence to their 2 very young children. The burden he was carrying was far too heavy for him to have to bear, and no sane person would even dare wish what he was going through on their worst enemy. This case was not only being investigated to find a missing person, but once found, the investigation continued for years after to find the perpetrators and bring them to justice. And as of today, the person authorities were fighting for turned out to be the alleged offender instead of a victim. The real victims in this case have become her family, her community who pulled together for her safe return, and the authorities involved which worked so hard to bring her justice. If you are looking to cheat on your spouse, if this is in fact what she did, but worried about getting caught, the discovery of the act of cheating would be less stress on your family than to plan your own abduction just to have a fling. For Keith, Sherri's horrible experience, which never happened, became his family's worst nightmare. And for what? A damn lie that absolutely makes no sense. So that's it for now, and as always, thank you so much for your support by watching and subscribing, and remember to ring the notification bell for updates and new content. Also, let me know what you think about this story in the comments, as feedback is appreciated and welcome.